Welcome back to the Bionicle Inspiration Series. Today's going to be a bit more of an interesting episode, a bit more advanced, a bit more in-depth. If you're somebody who really watches the show to gain some knowledge, to grow as a builder, I think this one might be of help to you. Today we're going to talk a bit about color blocking. It's going to be a little bit more in-depth. I'm going to read a little bit from an article, really good article. I'll link it in the description below. The website is called Build Like a Boss, and this was a little bit of a tutorial on color blocking. And color blocking was an episode I wanted to touch upon because it's certainly something that can really drastically improve a mock. It's sometimes a little bit difficult to understand, so I'll go into pretty heavy detail with it. And if it is a little confusing, rewatch the episode, see if that helps. But if not, I think when we start to talk about the 9 mocks that we've got in this episode today, that'll really help to kind of distill it down. And of course, if you've got questions, don't be afraid to hit me up because hey, if it gets a bit confusing, it gets a bit confusing. But I think I'm going to explain it pretty well. This article itself explained it really well, and I've kind of distilled it into my own words and added my own thoughts to it. So don't be afraid to read that article too. Or reach out if you've got any questions. But let's stop talking about what we're going to talk about, and let's actually start talking about what we're going to talk about. So color blocking. What is color blocking? So essentially, if you want to kind of take your color schemes on a mock to a different level, really refine it, make it look a little bit less messy and more refined and more visually pleasing, color blocking is certainly something you can do. So what does blocking mean in this color blocking thing? Well, kind of more or less the dictionary definition of blocking is grouping or the kind of the treatment of things into groups or blocks. So the idea of grouping the same kind of colors together. So if you're building something, building it so each color has its own kind of silhouette so that it makes the build kind of easier to process at first glance, and it can kind of stop things becoming, too messy, or using a bit of color blocking will help it just look a little bit more professional. So color blocking is a lot easier to do when you plan ahead. So really just kind of take your time as you're building and really focus on controlling the number of colors that you have, as well as the actual size of the specific blocks of color. So if that doesn't make sense, what does it specifically look like? So let's take a look at a mock here. This is a mock by Retinance, and this has got a bit of a posterized effect over the top of it, so you can really distinctly see the actual blocks of color. And we're going to do this throughout all of the mocks we talk about today in the episode, just so you can really distinctly see, like, this is a block of color. So you can see that the number of actual physical blocks of color are pretty low on this, and the areas that they inhabit are also very consistent. So for example, you can see that there is a large block of red on the feet and lower legs there. There's a large block of red on both arms, and there's this block of red on the top of the head. They're all sort of roughly the same size. They're very consistent. They're in very similar areas. So the blocks of red are unified in some fashion. There's also this larger block of yellow on the back there, which is kind of the scarf on this mock. And then the rest of it is this larger block of black. But then you've got this area here on the arm, which is a little bit closer to the scarf, whereas there's also this other sort of subtle little block of yellow. So this yellow bit on the arm here is a little bit of a different story to some degree, because there's already this really large block of yellow on the scarf. And this sort of little random small bit of yellow here, it kind of just seems a little out of place. Really effective color blocking is like we're seeing with the arms here. Larger blocks of red that are consistent with other areas of the mock. Red is a bit more of a dominant color in this, so it's dominant in a lot of different areas on this. Yellow is more of a highlight, and it's all just sort of in this one area. But then you get this little bit of yellow down there. It just kind of looks a little out of place, So that could be something that you might want to consider taking off, just so that you have this very distinct block of one color. But this is based off a specific source material, so that might be very accurate to the actual thing. So definitely, if you're doing something like that, if you're actually basing a mock off of something, definitely factor in that kind of balance between the two, because of course you might look at a design that's very well known and very, whatever it specifically is, and you go like, yeah, but I have to put that in, but actually that's not quite great color blocking to have that weird unexplained bit of yellow there or a bit of green or whatever. But if it's accurate and you're looking for accuracy, then by all means. So it's just focusing about managing your colors, really. Basically, it's all about ensuring that you have really, consistent blocks of color. And you don't just have these randomly included small or inconsistent patches of color in odd places. There's also the concept of color layering, which I often group these two terms together, but technically they are different. Color layering is the idea of if you're a person and you say you're an alien, you've got blue skin, and you put on a black shirt. You're not going to have black on your skin because, well, your skin's blue. So if you've got a mock that is purple and it has silver armor on top, it doesn't make sense that there would be silver underneath the purple. The silver would go on top because he's putting armor on, right? So layering your colors in that manner so that certain colors are on top and certain colors are below. And if there's an additional accent color, it's not underneath any of those if it doesn't make sense. So almost treat it like layers of clothing. You know, if you put on a purple shirt and then a black jacket and then a red scarf, the red's not going to be, you know, mixed in with other stuff. Unless, of course, it has a pattern on it, but that's irrelevant right now. You know, that sort of thing. So the two can kind of go hand in hand to some degree. And if you really focus on layering your colors so it visually makes sense with how it would be layered, and you actually block out your colors so that they are consistent and they're in set areas and it's not messy and all over the place, that makes a bit more sense. And can just look less messy and more refined. So it's all about consistency in size as well as the textures of the color as well. You can easily add in little small areas of a new color, but it has to still be consistent with the rest of the mock. So here's another example of a system spaceship that was on this article that I was referring to. You can see here there's these little bits of purple on the sides of the wings here, but that still makes sense within the color blocking because the purple is really just this little subtle accent. The only other bits of purple are on the cockpit and what appears to also be on the back. So the purple is just this subtle color. If, for example, there was this large stretch of pink, kind of, you know, tailing out of the back of the mock in some fashion, then those areas of pink might not be as consistent because there's these small little tiny things and there's already this big patch of it elsewhere. It doesn't make sense that there would be smaller little highlights of it elsewhere. So limiting your colors and grouping them really is kind of the best way to make sure that you're consistent. Stripping back colors, making sure you're not putting a huge amount in is definitely a good starting point. Obviously later you can, you know, maybe branch out, try like 4, 5, 6 different colors or something. But for now, yeah, strip it back. Just focus on maybe 1 or 2 colors. Maybe introduce a third if you're brave enough, you know, and just kind of practice with this color blocking thing. You know, practice will make perfect, of course. And, you know, reach out, talk to people, say, hey, what do you think of the color blocking on this? And you know, hopefully people can give you some positive feedback there, or message me. I'm happy to lend my thoughts on that. And yeah, just kind of keep practicing it if you're new to it. So here's another spaceship example that was on the article as well. This is kind of focusing on that of really limiting your colors, stripping them back and grouping them in areas. So the yellow on this mock is all in one set area. All of that yellow is unified and grouped together. None of it's sort of elsewhere on the mock or, you know, little random bits of it in weird places. And then underneath that is this layer of the gray. So those colors are very much grouped together. It's almost like if that gray area was sort of a barrel and over the top of that barrel you put like a cover that's yellow. It's kind of like that. And it's also a bit of color layering as well. So you're putting the yellow over the top of the gray and the yellow isn't underneath. So visually it makes sense. It's easier to look at. It's easier to just take in and it's not too messy. But often I find it always helps to look at a poor example of something so that you can really learn from that and see like, okay, what can I not be doing? So here is another example of an actually Bionicle mock this time that was on the article that I'm referencing here. So the reason this is poor color blocking, we can see at the top here, there's this very large yellow patch kind of on the chest and then these sort of branches out of the back of the mock there. So there's that larger patch of yellow. But then there's these very tiny little patches of yellow scattered throughout the rest of the mock. And that doesn't kind of make sense because there's this larger, very strong, prominent branch of yellow at the top and these little bits at the bottom. If you want to have consistent color layering, you should have yellow on the bottom be of roughly kind of the equal shape and size as the top. This is why we're doing that posterize effect. You can very clearly see there is this strong group of yellow at the top, these little bits down here. So you just kind of make that consistent if you were to refine that. But that was a very long description on color blocking. Hopefully it made a lot of sense. And if it doesn't, and you still got questions, as Yoda once said, clear your mind of questions. Forget all about that. Let go. Whatever. It doesn't make sense. Or if it did make sense, awesome, cool, you've got a good hang on it. Regardless, clear your mind. Let's look at a whole bunch of different examples of color blocking now, and hopefully you can wrap your head around it even more, or just see more examples of it, so you can continue to refine your understanding of color blocking and hopefully implement it in some mocks of your own. So this is a mock by Jack Frost, and it's called Robo Popo 2.0. I didn't read that name before this. That's hilarious. So, Robo Popo. How is this a good example of color blocking? So there's two very distinct blocks of color here, the red and the blue. This is very much a half and half thing, so it's a very easy example of color blocking in that regard, but it still looks fantastic. So yeah, in this case, they're totally even. The red is exactly the same amount as the blue there, and those two distinct blocks make sense. This is very striking, very easy to see, very easy to take in, and it's not messy or inconsistent in any way. And additionally, in terms of color layering, there's no blue on the red side or red on the blue side, So there's one example of color blocking there. Very good example indeed. Always cool as well to see a mock using Technic figures. Technic figures are always awesome. If you ever happen to get some, or you want to go pick one up on Bricklink or something, they're fairly cheap. They're always a fun thing to play around with because you can kind of get out of that sort of, humanoid character, Toa design and kind of branch out to like different mechs and things. And it's different to minifigure scales. It can be fun to play with. And they're made to be integrated into more Technic heavy things like Bionicle or CCBS and stuff. So Technic figures are really fun to play with. That's awesome. And a really cool weapon on this too. There's little sort of thin blade pieces there. There's these interesting weapons. It looks really cool. So nice work, Jack. Let's move on to the next mock. This is by Jafer, and it's called Voidwalker. So how's the color blocking used here? So we can see that all of the trans purple is in one distinct area on the kind of belly and neck of this mock. So it's all grouped in one area. And then additionally, there's little bits of purple beneath it. In terms of color layering, the white is always on top of that trans purple. And so we see that again here. The trans purple there is on top of that trans purple on the legs. So it makes a lot of sense there. But yes, all the white is grouped together. All the white is actually physically connected in some fashion. And then all the purple is as well. So the colors are consistent. There's roughly equal amounts of them. And it makes sense. And yes, the black here is... there's less black in regards to the purple and the whites. The black is definitely a sort of a more minor color on this mock. But that's okay because it's still consistent throughout. This is a really awesome mock by Jay for here. I actually really like the choice of colors here, specifically the kind of whites and the trans purple do give it this sort of a mystical flair to it, especially with a name like Voidwalker. You do get the sense this thing probably like travels through dreams or travels across like the astral plane or something weird and cool. And I think color scheme really effectively kind of represents that, this sort of mystical, magical kind of space look to it. I like it a lot. I also really like the face design, these sort of feathers kind of flowing down. It looks very mystical, very sort of otherworldly. It's really beautiful. I also like the unarmored legs at the bottom there, kind of how they sort of thin out like that. And it's just a really simplistic but beautiful design. So nice work, Jay. This next mock here is by Moko, and it's called Hell Warrior. So to some degree, the gunmetal and the black kind of blend together. So it almost looks like this mock is just, kind of like 90% black with a little bit of white at the top, which is really cool. So this is a really good example of color blocking where the actual colors, like before with Jack's mock, that was very much kind of 50-50 with the colors, how they were being spread. This is a great example of, doing that, having a very predominantly black mock with a little highlight of white. It's perfectly fine to do that, to add in a little tiny highlight of a specific color. But then it wouldn't necessarily make sense if there were little bits of white scattered throughout the rest of the mock. The actual physical blocks of color on this are a very large, big dominant black, and then a little tiny bit of white in there, which makes sense. It still looks good. It still visually makes a lot of sense. And in terms of color layering as well, this guy looks like he is a white-skinned sort of humanoid character wearing this big black and gunmetal suit of armor. But additionally, with that gunmetal, that's also quite consistent here. The actual blocks of gunmetal are kind of evenly spread throughout. There's kind of maybe one or two sort of evenly sized gunmetal pieces placed on each area of each limb. So, you see on the feet, there's that gunmetal mask piece. Then on the upper legs, there's that gunmetal kind of Knights Kingdom armor piece. So there's kind of, that one or two same sort of size, same sort of consistency of the gunmetal piece placed throughout. So there's still that consistency in the actual blocks there, which is awesome. But no, really love this character here. I love how Moko has used some of those macaroni pipe pieces here. A really fascinating, awesome texture that they can create, especially on the torso here, kind of creating this kind of rib cage look, but also this sort of actual kind of like tubing or piping look as well. And also how those are used kind of throughout this entire mock to kind of create this nice sense of unity and consistency. It's really, really nice. So there's an awesome mock and a really nice example of color blocking, especially when you're using a more dominant color and a smaller highlight as well. It's mocked by Ron Folkers and it's called Octane. So again, the colors are grouped together and they're consistent. And one thing that's awesome here is it's as simple as just making the limbs or kind of a set area of the mock one color. So the feet and the lower legs here are red, and that's the same on both legs there. The middle of this mock is white, and then the top of it's green. It's it's simple and it's easy. That can be the way you do it, just literally kind of dividing up the mock in two colors in that regard. And that can be effective color blocking, you know. Sometimes you can be a little bit more complex with it, like we've already seen, and sometimes it can be as simple as that. You know, cutting a mock in half, cutting it in quarters, or cutting it in 3, or whatever, and just layering the colors in that regard, which I think is a great way of doing it, and an awesome job there by Ron. An awesome thing on this mock too is this really cool like blast effect that he's got here, getting a bunch of these trans-clear dishes and creating this sort of almost sort of like sound wave effect that's kind of coming out of this blaster on his arm there. That's really, really cool. I like that a lot. I also love a little bit of Octane love. Octane is the made-up petrol company that LEGO has a lot of their city sets based around, and that thing's been around for ages, and so I love the idea of making a Bionicle that represents that made-up company. That's really cool. Next mock by Soya, and this is called Split Face because this is a revamp of the Hero Factory set Split Face. This is another great example of a half and half mock. However, this one's a little bit different and I really like that. So it's still consistent in its blocks of color. So the gunmetal is in that one specific area. And the areas of gunmetal flow into one another. All of the red is still grouped together. And there's that little highlight of lime and trans green. Those colors are more or less the same, just a different shade of green, but they're very small, but they're still very consistent with where they're put. So that little tiny highlight there still works because when green is introduced on this mock, it's in a very small block. That's the other thing too, it's still for the most part even, this split. It's just a different way of doing the split. So instead of it being like directly down the middle, it's sort of off to the side and kind of almost in a sort of S shape to some degree, the actual physical split of color here. But then it's made consistent again by making one of the arms and one of the legs gunmetal. So if you were to kind of divide up the colors, it probably is still 50-50 in terms of that split, but it's just, putting them in slightly different areas. So you still get that really effective, different block of color, but, it's just in different areas of the mock, which is totally fine as long as the actual physical grouping or physical block of that color is consistent across the whole thing, which for the most part it is. So I also really like this take on Split Face because the actual set more or less was that direct split down the middle. But, kind of recreating that can be a little bit difficult to some degree because if you're building a more sort of custom chest using a whole bunch of different pieces and those sort of prefab elements, it can be difficult to get that exact 50-50 split and still have a sort of symmetrical torso like this. So the idea of doing what he's done, of having it sort of split off to the side to some degree to really match the face and to just be a different take on the character. I really like that. It's really smart. So nice work. Next one here, this is by VB and is called Unseen Adversary. So I'll just explain the concept of this mock first and then I'll talk about the color blocking on it because I think it's really smart. This was actually made for the Bio Cup last year. The theme for that round, I believe, was monsters. And so his description here was Unseen Adversary, a fearsome thing indeed. And then someone in the description here worded it very well and he said, and as far as true monsters go, heart disease is surely one of the scariest. I love that take on monsters. It's just really creative and really clever, and also just a really beautiful mock. So always cool to see people sort of stretching the boundaries there of creativity and really taking a theme and thinking outside the box with it. I love that. So the color blocking on this, it's predominantly dark red all over, but there is this sort of subtle hint of dark blue. And again, there doesn't need to be this 50-50 split of color. The dark blue is just this subtle highlight. It's this little pop. But then there's also this other pop of just plain red. So not dark red, the plain red piece here, which sort of represents the element of heart disease, like a tumor of some kind, which again is a really, really well done representation of that. That's awesome. So great job of blocking these colors here for sure. I really like the use of some of the textures on this mock as well. I mean, the shaping is beautiful. There's not really any gaps in this. It looks like a actual human heart. But one thing that's so awesome about it is that these sort of more smooth pieces have this sort of very shiny texture to them, and actually makes it look like an actual human heart looks, or any heart for that matter. That sort of weird sheen that muscles and organs can have. So it's a really, really interesting way of playing with that texture there. That's quite unique. So really well done, VB. That's awesome to see. There's another mock by IGU and it's called Split Spirit. This is another example of just a 50-50 split. So really obvious, straightforward way of blocking these colors. It's just a cut down the middle. The silver, of course, is consistent on all sides there, as is the amount of trans orange and the amount of trans light blue there. That is consistent, of course. because it's literally a symmetrical mirrored copy, which is a very effective way of playing with your color blocking there. I still love how he's used those Hero Factory barrel prison pieces that came on the Invasion from Below Lego sets. It's really cool because those pieces were sort of a half and half thing, and as he's done here specifically on the head, he was able to get one in one color and one in the other color and put them together, so you can actually get that direct split down the middle there, which is very clever. And also the idea of putting all the silver there where it intersects, so you don't have to worry about getting that exact split of color. You just put the silver over the top of it, and you can imagine that it splits down the middle behind that silver armor. And that's another great example of color layering as well. The silver is always on top of those translucent colors and not underneath, so it does look like this is a being that is half orange and half blue with silver armor over the top of that, which is great. So yeah, great to see him playing around with some translucent colors, and a great way of playing with that prison capsule barrel piece as well. Really, really nicely done. There's a lot of translucent pieces with modern sort of CCBS stuff, so it's great to see people playing around with it. Second last mock here, this is by Alex Park Designs and is called Trashy. Which is awesome, by the way. I just read the description on this. This is a Lego monster project. It's a character, creature, and monster mock inspired by kids' art. That's so cool. So it's taken art that some kids have drawn and made it into an actual Bionicle character there. That's such a cool idea. So one thing I like about this mock here is the sword kind of can act as another extra pop of yellow to make it a bit more prominent. You know, at the moment that yellow is more of a less dominant color here, and that pop of yellow on the sword helps to bring it out a little bit more. That being said, if it didn't have the sword, I still think it would work, because I think a lot of this color layering, the color blocking here still makes a lot of sense, because it kind of fits in with the clothing that this mock is wearing. So for example, the yellow there is sort of a shirt, and then over the top of that shirt is a sort of red jacket of some kind with a little sort of white bit of jewelry or something. And then he's got this green dress underneath it, and then the black is just the natural color of this character here. So that's a really great way of focusing in on how to block your colors as well, is to, you know, figure out the actual elements of clothing or armor or whatever the mock is physically wearing or has on them, and then actually blocking out the colors in that way, which goes hand in hand with color layering, of course, as well. So I think it's really well done, and you know, yes, certain colors here are more prominent, but that doesn't mean that the blocking is not consistent. And now for the last one, this is by Red, and it's called Canine Multi-Purpose Support Unit. I love this mock so much. It's so cool. So again, I think by now it makes a lot of sense. The colors are blocked in a specific fashion. The tan is consistent throughout. The black is consistent throughout, and they're layered in a fashion that makes sense. And then, of course, the layering again with the silver over the top of everything. This dog is wearing cool combat armor. I love the shaping on this mock so much. It looks exactly like a dog. And it's a beautiful blend of system and Bionicle as well, specifically on the head there. That's a brilliant way of designing a dog-like face. And yeah, the textures of those system pieces very perfectly flow into the CCBS pieces as well. It's awesome, awesome stuff. So there's been a whole bunch of examples on color blocking. Hopefully that makes a lot of sense. I respect that that was a big information dump there and a lot of new concepts, and that might have been a new way of looking at color for you on a mock. And so, like I said, if you still have questions, be sure to hit me up. And maybe you're watching this and you're like, actually, I've got some points that I'd like to make on color blocking. Be sure to share that with the world, whether it's on my social media, my Discord, or on your own social media and Discord and stuff. You know, I always think that's a great thing to do. If you have thoughts about the episode and you want to share them, or you know, continue your thinking on it, there's nothing wrong with that, because then multiple people's perspectives are being shared with the world, and multiple people can be inspired in different areas and places, and it's a great idea, actually. So there you go. That's been an episode on color blocking. If you enjoyed the mocks that you saw in today's episode, or you want to read that article to get a different perspective on color blocking, they're in the links in the description below, so be sure to check that out. Additionally, in the description below is the submission email, so if you want to submit your own mocks to the show, you can do so through that. Send me some pictures or any other information you want to in an email. Send that to me, and you'll be good to go, and eventually I'll feature it on the show. But I get a lot of submissions, so your patience is key, but I do my best to feature every single submission that gets submitted, but that'll take some time, of course. Also, there's links to my social media in the description below. You can check out some of the other stuff that I've got going on there. Got a lot of new content coming over on my like Flickr and Instagram and stuff, so be sure to stay tuned to that and check all that sort of stuff out. But that's it for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Maybe it's time to start experimenting with a little bit of color blocking. Thanks, guys. See you soon. Bye for now.